Is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the 2018 Financial Status Update. My name is Jamie Mullen, and I am a Senior Benefit Specialist here at Empers. I specialize in retirement and disability counseling for our covered members. Before we get on with the Financial Status Update, I would just like to point you towards or remind you of the Education on Demand section of our website. Through Education on Demand, you have access to our webinar series, targeted topics, benefit basics, and a history of financial status updates. Our goal with this presentation is to provide you with a snapshot of the financial condition of Empers and to review the policies that are in place to fund your future benefits. Our presenter today is Scott Simon. Scott is the Executive Director of Empers. And now I'll turn it over to you, Scott.
All right, very good. Thank you, Jamie, and good day, everyone. I appreciate you taking some time for this update, and with that, I'll just get right with it here. The primary objectives for today's presentation is to give you an update on the funded status, as Jamie mentioned, and along with that, a little bit different spin this year than years past, in that we're going to identify the assets that are available and then talk about plan costs a little bit more, because those are both relative to the funded status and how we determine that. So we'll spend a little time on that, and then we'll close briefly with a progress update. So first, funded status. What is the financial condition of the system? As a general rule, we use a common measure, which is the system's funded status, that determines what the condition of the system is. All right, well, what is the funded status? The funded status is the ratio of assets available to cover the cost of benefits earned. Now, I underline both of those for purpose there, as we're going to talk a little bit more about those two components here in just a moment. The objective is to have 100% of the assets needed to pay the benefits earned. So, jumping right to it, our funded status update for FY18 is still at 57.1%. That may or may not strike you as odd. It is a little unusual given our circumstances, and it'll hopefully make a little more sense to you as I go through this on why our funded status is actually holding steady at 57%. As a general rule, you would normally expect it to go up or down slightly, and I'll explain that as we go through the presentation. So first, let's focus on the assets available as part of the equation in determining the funded status for the system. Assets available is essentially the cash and investments that we have on hand. And by looking at this chart, if you look on the lower right of that pie graph, you'll see we essentially have no cash. We're all but fully invested, so it's pretty simple for us. We just simply look at the assets that we have on hand and invested, and you'll see that we have a little over $2.3 billion invested today. I should point out that from last year to this year, we enjoyed almost a 9.5% return on our assets. So we had a really nice year this last year, and that would compare favorably not only to our policy benchmarks and our assumed rate of return for funding purposes, but also will compare favorably to our peers in the public pension universe. So that part of the ratio in the funded status equation is pretty straightforward, pretty simple to get your hands around that. What's not quite so straightforward is determining the plan costs. When you're determining the plan costs, you have to rely on an actuary. So we hire an actuary, and an actuary is someone or a mathematician that creates models to estimate costs for future financial events. And as part of that process, the actuary completes evaluation. And you've heard about that before if you've listened to these funded updates. So what is an actuarial evaluation? Well, I'm just going to jump straight to the second bullet there. In simple terms, it is a mathematical process that determines the plan's contribution rate and funded status. It is actually a pretty complicated process, and we're sure not going to try to go through all that today. But I'll try to paint a picture for you that maybe you can get your hands around and understand what that process involves. And there are 7 steps here that I'm going to cover briefly to summarize the valuation process. First of all, we have to identify the covered member data. So we have to identify the members of the system, which includes our retirees, our actives, our former members, survivors, disabled members, and so on. Secondly, we have to identify our asset data, which we just talked about that just a moment ago. Then we have to identify the specific benefit provisions, eligibility criteria and benefit amounts that are applicable to the various plans that we administer. Those are important. then we have to make assumptions, or the actuary must make assumptions concerning future expectations. And it's those assumptions that make this process extremely complicated. And let me give you for instance here. The actuary will actually look at each individual member of the plan and go through a set of assumptions to arrive at a cost just for that member. So let me give you an example here. So here are some of the criteria that the actuary will actually consider when determining a plan cost. So just on one member, they'll look at that person's age when they were hired, and from that they will determine how long we expect that person to work, how will their pay progress over the career that person works, when will that person retire, and what will the benefit be at that point, and how long will that person receive that benefit, and so on. So you get a feel for all of the aspects involved and the assumptions involved in arriving at a cost. When you do that for every single member, you can imagine it's a pretty detailed process. But that's what's done behind the scenes for us, and we'll show you some of the results of that data in just a moment. So once those assumptions are arrived at and made and worked through, then there's a funding method that is utilized, and it's not terribly important, but I'll mention it. It's the entry age actuarial cost method. In this method, with this method, rather, the level percent of payroll is determined that will fund a member's retirement benefit over the member's entire working lifetime. So when the actuary is trying to figure out what's this plan cost, and then we're trying to fund it, we're funding it from the point in time when that person becomes a member of the system to the point in time when that person terminates their employment. So over that period, the actuary is saying, all right, we need to fund it at this level to ensure that we have sufficient cash on hand to pay the benefit that individual earned. And then moving on, we mathematically combine these assumptions, the funding method, and the data to arrive at a cost, and the result is then our funded status and a contribution rate. So here's a snapshot from our valuation. I've circled a couple of numbers there on the table. The first number, the top number, is the actuarial accrued liability. It's essentially the cost of the plan, or the cost of the benefits that have been earned thus far for the plan. And the number right below it would be the actuarial value of assets. If you take the actuarial value of assets and divide it by the liability, you arrive at the 57.1%, which you saw a moment ago, and that is our current funded status. And we also said that the valuation process results in a contribution rate. If you'll look at the far right-hand side of that table, you will see the column for our combined rate. And starting from the top, you see our normal cost is 11.72%. And then there's a number below that, which is our unfunded liability. And then if you go almost to the bottom, to the total line, you'll see our contribution rate, which is 58%. It's a pretty high number. I'm not going to go into why that is, because we've talked about that in previous funding updates. So if you want an update on that, by all means, go back and listen to some of those updates. But what you normally would see with that 58%, you think, my goodness, we've got an expensive benefit program here. And the truth is, no, that's not really the case, because the true cost of our benefits is actually the 11.72%. The normal cost number represents the real cost of this plan. The unfunded liability, or what we often call the catch-up payment for not having the funds paid in previously, or from the Great Recession, posed a challenge for us to overcome as well. That is making up the lion's share of that contribution rate. So we won't dwell a lot on that, just want you to be aware of the components associated with our contribution rate that the covered employers pay. All right, let's move on to progress. So we, if you listen to the update last year, I mentioned that we had an experience study forthcoming, and we did do that this last February. And broadly put, an experience study is testing our assumptions against past experience to determine if they are reasonable. So it's something that we do essentially every 5 years, maybe a little more often than that, but usually every 5 years. And we already talked about those assumptions. The example I gave you a moment ago when we talked about, how long will a member work, how much will their pay or how will their pay progress, those kind of things. We evaluate those assumptions. We also evaluate our economic assumptions, which are things like how much investment return do we expect to get, what is inflation going to be, those sort of things. And with our experience study that we just completed earlier this year, the board made the decision to lower those expectations. So, for example, when we lower our investment rate of return expectations, by lowering that, we're saying, we're not going to get as much from the markets by lowering it. So that means that somewhere that money's got to come from. That puts upward pressure on the contribution rates that our employers pay. So we're saying a little bit less is going to be coming in from the investment return aspect, and it puts upward pressure on the employer for employer contributions. So it's important to recognize that we lowered some of those assumptions, economic assumptions, and on the flip side, on the liability side or the benefit side, we're seeing mortality improvements. In other words, people are living longer. So our members are part of that group. Obviously, they're living longer. If you're living longer, that means you're getting paid more benefits. That puts upward pressure as well on the plan. So those are some of the assumptions that we changed as a result of the experience study. And when you make those sort of changes, you would naturally expect that our funded status would decline. But it didn't. You already saw that. Our actual funded status actually remained steady at 57%. Normally that would have dropped. And the reason that it didn't drop, there are two reasons. One is that I already mentioned that we had the nice investment return this last year at almost 9.5%. The other reason is we have this reserve fund that is one of the funding policies we have that sort of smooths our experience out. So we were able to maintain a flat funded status, which is good news from my perspective. And making a change in these assumptions is also important in that we continue to fund the plan as we have in the recent past and make sure that we get the funded status up to 100%, as I mentioned earlier. So we have made progress, and I think that's demonstrated with this particular chart here. I've highlighted a row at the very bottom there that shows you where our funded status would have been had we not made the change in our economic or made a change with our economic or demographic assumptions for funding the plan. It would have actually jumped over 59%. So there's progress there. It's just taken away because we lowered those assumptions, and because of that, our funded status has stayed flat for this year. So hopefully you make some sense out of that. But that shows you that we're making some progress here. It does take time, but we're vastly improved from where we were just a few years ago. As you look at the column there on the funded ratio showing back 2009, 2010, where we were in the low to mid 40s, and now we're almost to 60%. So that is real progress. We're pleased with that. So without going into all the details associated with our funding policies, what has supported our progress, and it is the funding policies that we have in place. And if you're interested in learning more about those policies, I would encourage you to go to some of the material that is on our website. The document you see on your left is our actuarial valuation report. It certainly covers all of those policies, or something that you might find is a little bit more friendly read is what we call our Emperor's FYI. That's a document that has evolved over the years into a summary annual financial report format. It's still a number of pages, but it's abbreviated from our comprehensive report. So I'd encourage you to go out there and look at that. There's a lot of information in that document, and certainly those policies, those funding policies that I mentioned, are in there, and you could go in and read about those and how those apply. So that is essentially the update for this year. Hopefully we've covered everything to some level where it makes some sense for you. We talked about our funded status is updated to 57.1%, remain flat relative to last year. We covered the assets that are part of the equation in determining that funded status, and then spent a little bit of time on the plan costs and how those are arrived at, and then closed with the progress. If you have any questions about any of this, we certainly welcome those. Feel free to go out to our website and shoot us an email at empers@empers.org, or talk to our benefit specialist. If you have questions about any of this, we'd be happy to answer it. With that, I will conclude my remarks, and I will turn it over to Jamie to close the program.
Thank you very much, Scott. And thank you again, audience, for attending. As Scott mentioned, you can visit our website, empers.org, if you have a need for more information, or you can always email a benefit specialist at empers@empers.org. Thank you very much.